Hello. Hi, you guys. All right. So with today's, it's primarily um, it's a video assignment, as you see here. And so if you
Hey, can
have
you
the
hear me?
chance, it'd be wonderful for you to be able to look at all of them. But if not, that's all right. So the
Hey,
first
bro.
one, right, is on the Red Scare and Stalin terror, the Cold War. Explain from the data in the video what President Truman meant in saying that the US would not turn into a right-wing totalitarian government in order to combat a left-wing totalitarian threat. So that's a common theme in Cold War historiography, is that the United States, in the midst of its second Red Scare in the 1950s, started becoming the very monster that we feared, right? Becoming very repressive, utilizing tactics that the Soviet Union used, the bad guy. And so you look at that, right, and you look at a few factors that led to it. This, for one, was addressed issues of espionage. There were some instances, if you wanted to look up like Alger Hiss, HISS, if you wanted to look up the Rosenberg couple, you want to look up a guy named Chevalier, Chevalier. You look these people up, and there were instances of the Soviet Union infiltrating the State Department, infiltrating the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico, with nuclear armament. There were cases of them getting into, like I said, you do the Cold War by PBS, and it's a fascinating series of videos. And like I said, a gentleman gets on there and said that the Russians had access to everything. And that might have been a little bit boastful and a little bit hyperbole, but there was some truth to Russian espionage. So Truman, we had lie detectors put in. He established the CIA. The FBI had already been going with a predecessor to the FBI from at least the 1920s. But Hoover was given a very, J. Edgar Hoover was given a very long leash, especially in his counterintelligence program, where he was allowed to bug people's phones, and get into their personal property, their personal space and correspondence, etc. The CIA engaged in coups and overthrew foreign governments, etc. And then you also had red baiting, particularly by the Republican Party. They went after Truman and the Democrats, and it was an easy tool to use. And they would say that the Democrats are soft on communism. They don't perceive the true threat. They're to blame for the loss of China and Mao Zedong's revolution to communism. And so it became, part of political discourse for the
Hey,
Democrats,
bro.
almost have to compensate and try to prove to the Republicans and to their constituents, to the electorate, that they were not soft on communism. And the Republicans ran with the whole crusader type of image. And you see that right in the video with a young Nixon, Richard Nixon, as a Republican. So at any rate, you have those types of components that feed into it. Um, and so you see, if you watch this video, you're gonna see the McCarthy trials. They call it McCarthyism because it was a whole brand of bogus due process, whereby if you were even affiliated with a radical labor union, with any type of writing or directors in Hollywood, that even tampered with the idea of class warfare, redistribution of wealth. So I kid you not, like doing a Robin Hood movie could get you in trouble, right? Stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, that you supposedly had a communist undertone that you were trying to hide beneath your message. And just take a look at the video if you can. And it got downright scary and silly as far as these McCarthy trials. The House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC, they went on a couple big, red scares. The Hollywood one might have been the most, salient of them, but they also went after labor unions and other organizations as well, and eventually, the State Department, until Eisenhower finally asked Congress to give a gag order against Senator McCarthy of Wisconsin, saying he had gone too far with lack of sufficient evidence. And so with the Red Scare and so forth, you see there with Truman saying that, right, that we're not going to be turned into the very enemy that we're so afraid of in order to combat that enemy. And so that was really ubiquitous in the late 40s and throughout the 50s, early to mid 50s, with Truman and Eisenhower as the presidents. So if you like to choose that one, by all means, but if you have the time to look at it, even if you should choose 2 or 3, I'd highly recommend you doing such, if possible. The Cuban Missile Crisis at the Brink by PBS. Please balance a defense of the Soviet Union's leadership with criticism of the Soviet government regarding the precarious military or nuclear showdown amidst the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so I think the video is fairly, it's not super in depth, but it's very balanced. I feel like it's very balanced in giving the Soviet perspective. Why in the heck would the Soviets place, up to 62 intercontinental ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba, 90 miles off the Florida Keys, facing the United States, some of which had the capacity of wiping out, the video states, 98% of our country's territory, continental territory. And so some scary stuff, right? So why in the world would they do that? Well, the video will mention the Bay of Pigs invasion. It very briefly mentions Operation Mongoose. And Operation Mongoose was a CIA attempt to take the life of Fidel Castro. Also, what you don't see in this video is Fidel Castro getting insulted in his trip to the US. When he first engaged in his revolution, right, from the Sierra Madre region of Cuba against Fulgencio Bautista, Bautista really can be depicted with some supportive evidence as an oligarch, as being very repressive, as being very corrupt, and is not necessarily being very popular in a microcosm of his complete island and people. And so at any rate, there is some evidence to suggest that the anti-Bautista revolution was popular, was popularly embraced. So, you got to remember that when you think of the Truman Doctrine, because remember with the Truman Doctrine, we stated that anywhere where a peaceful, unarmed majority is threatened by the forceful imposition of communism by an armed minority, numerical minority, or foreign nation, the U.S. will come and defend that peaceful majority. Because the idea is, right, as I think of, like, George W. Bush with Iraq, him saying, who in the world would not want a Western style Republican government, right? A representative democracy. Why in the world would the Iraqi people want a dictatorship instead? And that was the type of assumption that was behind the Truman Doctrine, is that no majority of people would ever actually want communism, because we thought of communism in its Stalin-like brand, right? And you could tell if you watch the first video, you get a taste of how repressive Stalin could be. And so at any rate, but you run into a little bit of a dilemma here, because at a few key points, with a few, if you look at a few things as perhaps indicative of popular will, you're running into the dilemma of a possibly popular Cuban leader in Fidel Castro. And so when he first was successful, he didn't come out as being a communist. Matter of fact, he denied that he was communist. He came on a goodwill tour to the US, and President Eisenhower snubbed him and refused to meet with him. He sent Nixon instead, and Nixon pretty much reprimanded him and gave him a lecture about incorporating and allowing and cooperating with communists in his revolution, and how that ought not to be. And then also, then from there on, he didn't pass our duck test that the CIA had, right? If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. He engaged in a land redistribution program, an agricultural distribution program. And so from that, but what also doesn't look good in our sources is, he really went after like Standard Fruit, and some of the big oil and fruit companies owned by U.S. corporations. And those corporations were highly connected to people like Alan and John Foster Dulles, Dulles, the Dulles brothers, the head of the CIA and a big person in the State Department. They had a conflict of interest in having their property confiscated, expropriated from them, their revenue taken from them, and from what Castro was doing. So we contended that he failed the duck test and that he clearly was a communist. And the argument remains as to what extent did we push Fidel Castro toward communism and into the arms of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, we at Operation Mongoose, we had attempts at his life. And then we tried the Bay of Pigs invasion, right? And it'll go over that in the video. 1,400 Cuban immigrants thought they could invade by U.S. training and U.S. equipment and U.S. help, limited help, that thought that they could invade and foment a popular rebellion to topple Castro. Well, the island supported Castro and the armed forces supported Castro, and they squashed this Bay of Pigs invasion, and it was humiliating. They had a fighter pilot who had flown over and been shot down, and he had the Cuban writings on his jet and so forth, until someone literally scraped off the main coating, the superficial coating of the plane, and it showed the American red, white, and blue. And they put this on television. And so clearly it was an American jet fighter. So clear evidence that the U.S. was behind it. We had them trained in Nicaragua and in the Panama Zone. And we equipped them, etc. And at the last minute, because JFK had promised not to get involved in invading Cuba, he reneged on the aerial support that he was going to flagrantly give the Bay of Pig invaders. And so at any rate, that was humiliating for our new president of Kennedy, but it made a martyr. It made the classic underdog of Castro. That here it was like David versus Goliath, and Goliath was picking on him and trying. So to whatever extent we may have alienated him and made an enemy of him unnecessarily. And then under that context, does Khrushchev put the intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear tip missiles, on the Cuban island. In the video, we'll mention we had missiles in Turkey and Italy and elsewhere facing the Soviet Union. And so I feel like it gives a pretty fair, balanced context and perspective to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And take a look and see, as you'll find in the video, some people connect it to conspiracy theories of Kennedy's assassination. Kennedy is going to feel a sense of alienation from his Joint Chiefs of Staff and XCOM, as they were called, his innermost military leadership clique that gave him advice. They were war hawks. They wanted to attack and invade Cuba. They wanted to shoot nuclear missiles toward the Soviet Union and basically start World War III. And he and his brother, Bobby Kennedy, seem to have had cooler heads to prevail. As a matter of fact, in one instance, Khrushchev had sent a very volatile, hostile message threatening the United States in the midst of this crisis. And Bobby Kennedy had the simple idea. He said, you know what, let's just pretend this hostile letter never came. Let's look at the less confrontational one where he was more rational and was open to compromise. And let's just ignore the other one and address this one. And so you see a sense of maturity, a sense of restraint. Some people say the finest hour that the Kennedys had during this missile crisis. And so they do something that is a lot less abrasive and provocative, is they engage in a blockade and a naval blockade around Cuba to prohibit any further importation onto the island of any military equipment, etc. And the ships supposedly became nose to nose, and there was a showdown, and it was very tense. You'll see in the video a couple American pilots flying over Cuba and one over Russia were shot down in the midst of these 13 critical days. And we could have, the Warhawks of XCOM were of course calling for a belligerent response from the United States. And then there's evidence, as you see in the video, that Khrushchev was under the same type of Warhawk influence by his leaders of the Politburo and whoever it was in his inner circle, were kind of gung-ho themselves. So it seems as if the cooler heads did prevail, thankfully for the world, for our generation, etc. Because as you know, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear power to destroy all living life on the earth like 8 times over. And so obviously that was averted, thankfully. And so, if you want to take a look at that video, should you not choose it, I would still highly recommend such. But
I have a question,
yeah.
Derek.
Yes.
Sorry, I meant to interrupt you.
Not at all.
So communism was influenced by the Communist Manifesto?
Yes. Yes.
And when the Communist Manifesto was written by Karl Marx?
Karl Marx and Joseph Engels. That's right.
And Karl Marx, is he depicted as a good person or as a bad person because of influence communism? Because from my understanding, he helped like start some revolutions against slavery and oppression, right? Or am I wrong?
Oh man, with slavery and oppression, it's been too long, Kevin. I don't want to commit to anything that I no longer fully recall. I apologize. But what I do know is he's seen as the intellectual founder, he and Engels, as the intellectual founders of communism, socialism, syndicalism, gas and water socialism, all the Marxist derivative isms on the far left of the spectrum, involving, the doing away with private property and some form of collective ownership of property and resources.
From the rich?
Absolutely from the rich.
And would you say...
Go ahead.
Would you say that like communism falls directly in line with his writings, or do you believe it's been manipulated or twisted up a little bit for government purposes, or do you think it just falls right in line with his ideology?
I to that question, I feel relatively confident in stating that most academics that I've read contend that his writings have almost never been faithfully adhered to in a communist country by a communist government. Oftentimes, um, he's not criticized, but different followers, whether it be Mao Zedong of China, Joseph Stalin, or Vladimir Lenin of the Soviet Union, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, whoever it might be, right? Oftentimes you'll find the argument of them contending they they were uh, they were guilty of distorting and not faithfully following the writings of Karl Marx. What some people do still contend, right? Americans, especially conservative Americans, contend is that a couple sources of criticism of Marx is, for one, they contend that while his critical synopsis, his critique of capitalism was right on point, as far as, that which is morally and kind of pragmatically and economically unhealthy about capitalist systems, and what oftentimes happens as far as a growing gulf between the rich and the poor, the establishment of a small oligarchy that begins to engage in vertical integration and taking over, and horizontal integration and taking over entire industries. A lot of people say that, he was almost prophetic in being able to demonstrate that. They contend that his solutions to those problems are not realistic, are not practical, that are not congruent with human nature. And I've said it before, the common conservative argument is like with the kulak farmers of the Ukraine, when Stalin tried to get them to engage in collectivization of agriculture. He would have them work, right? Some worked harder than others and brought about much higher yields in wheat bushels per harvest than their neighbors. And he had them paid, compensated based upon their family size, regardless of how hard they had worked. And you see a lot of the Ukrainians beginning to rebel in a myriad of ways. Some of them rebelled in the passive way and saying, wait a minute, I work twice as hard as my neighbor, but because he has more kids than I, he gets paid more than I do. That's not, quote, fair. So they stop working as hard, or they start understating how many bushels of wheat they had collected, and they privately sell it on the side, right, under the nose of Stalin. So there were a couple stereotypical ways in which the Ukrainian kulaks rebelled against his system. And to conservative Americans, they feel like that is not that's not unique to Ukrainian kulaks, that is a universal phenomenon, that touches on something that we might characterize as human nature, that we have a sense of fairness that Marxism doesn't take account of. It does, but like Vladimir Lenin of the Soviet Union, they feel like by indoctrination of young children, that they feel like instead of it being inherent within us, that sense of fairness, of meritocracy, of getting what we work for, that they believe that it is environmentally indoctrinated into us. And so hence they could undo that, especially beginning with the children, and get them to teach them to think cooperatively instead of competitively, and by the everything right by necessity, by need, rather than by merit. And to this day, some people believe that that's not the truth. that that's not accurate appraisal of what some people consider human nature.
I think, yeah, I'm just getting a little bit confused because I feel like when you heard the word like communism, I feel
Uh-huh.
like it's related to like oppression and stuff like that. It's what people comes to people's minds. But I was under the impression that he was against slavery and stuff like that. And so it's a little bit confusing.
It is. And in his writings, right, Kevin, his ultimate goal was, like I jokingly say, like that Imagine song by John Lennon. His ultimate goal of communism was no government at all and the free cooperation of all people and shared allocation of resources. And so absolutely, people have reason to state that especially leaders like Joseph Stalin absolutely perverted some of his writings. And then just one more aside, as far as critique of Marx, is Marx, of course, to some conservative Americans, they don't like the fact that Marx, and especially here during the 1950s, they didn't like the fact that Marx was hostile toward religion, right? He stated that religion is like an oxycontin pill, right? That just is there to numb the poor, give them false hope, so they won't rebel, so they won't expect anything in this life, but that is just a drug to tame them and keep them from rebelling. And so he was a bit hostile toward religion, not just collectively and institutionally, but
An interesting
ideologically.
perspective, though.
Yeah,
It's an interesting thing to say.
yeah. And so when people say it's the opiate of the masses, they're quoting they're actually quoting a follower of Karl Marx. I once had his name memorized and I don't anymore. I apologize. But just because Marx didn't use that term opiate himself, I think it's safe to say that's what he thought, from what I've read long ago in the 90s from his works. All right. And so at any rate, you could choose number 2. And then number 3, American Experience documentary on Vietnam. Okay, so it gives much information from a Vietnamese perspective. Consequently, please write a page arguing how this video suggests that this war was ill-advised, immoral, or inconsistent with American ideals. And I want to warn you that there's some graphic images on that one. All right. So from this one, you're going to get the perspective of Ho Chi Minh, a lot of great man history of this quiet, humble, very dedicated and zealous man that took on the name Ho Chi Minh. And you're going to see, evidence of his popularity. You're going to see evidence of the lack of popularity of Ngo Dinh Diem, the American guy, the American supported leader of Southern Vietnam underneath the 17th parallel. You're going to see evidence of the Geneva Convention telling them that there's going to be in 1956 a referendum and a general election on leadership, and Ngo Dinh Diem refused because he knew he would lose. He knew he was not nearly as popular as Ho Chi Minh. So again, that premise of the Truman Doctrine, right? We're contending that we're going to protect, as the policemen of the world, we're going to protect peaceful majorities from the forceful imposition of communism. But when you find, especially with the National Liberation Front and the Viet Cong in the South, and find evidence for the popularity of communism in South Vietnam, it gets messy, it gets ugly. It gets to the point where we're thinking, my goodness, maybe the majority of Vietnamese people actually want communism. And you got to remember also the alluring nature of communism, the idea of equal allocation of everything when you're a poor peasant country. That can be very enticing, that type of ideology. And then not to mention just the fact that we made enemies when we came in there. They called us the round eyes. We were physiologically different from them, coming into their territory. And, on the search and destroy missions, going in through different villages and then encountering guerrilla warfare. I remember guerrilla in Spanish is little warfare. And so it's you don't go by the rules. You don't necessarily wear a uniform and fight on a battlefield, but you attack in raids, you attack in civilian clothing, and so forth. And God knows there was plenty of that, of guerrilla warfare against the American soldiers. So as you'll see in the video, they said, they couldn't discern friend from foe, not by village, not by attire, as far as a uniform or not wearing a uniform, not by age, as sometimes children were killing the soldiers. And just what a mess, what a messy, vicious war Vietnam was. And so if you want to look at number 3, by all means, take a look at it. Something else of note is that, and then in fighting it, we fought at a place called Da Nang and Ya Drang. And at these places, our leaders told the press, and as far as I'm concerned, I think they were accurate in this appraisal, is we literally had a 10-to-1 casualty ratio advantage in those battles at Ya Drang and Da Nang. We killed 10 Northern Vietnamese or Viet Cong soldiers for every 1 American soldier killed. So we said, we're going to win in a battle of attrition. They're going to run out of men, with that 10-to-1 ratio being carried out throughout the war. But of course, it didn't happen that way. And of course, you have the illicit, help of Laos and Cambodia when you look up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and people and supplies were flooding in from those so-called neutral countries. And of course, you look at Operation Thunder. We tried aerial bombardment, just in ungodly numbers, in quantity, and they built underground trenches and so forth, and they survived the aerial bombardment. So that it took, there was no option of using drones, as they talked about in Afghanistan. It took foot soldiers to go into these places and to ferret out the enemy. And so the whole, search and destroy didn't seem to work. It did as far as killing more Vietnamese soldiers than it did Americans, but as far as ending the war, it just didn't seem to work. And so they brought in a guy named Creighton Abrams to take over, to replace the first gentleman, Westmoreland. And he tried to pacify the villages and win hearts and minds. And some historians think that was a much better strategy, but that it was too little too late when Creighton Abrams began changing our strategy. And then, of course, as you see, if you've heard of the Tet Offensive, Westmoreland had just boasted that the enemy was on the ropes and just about to quit and losing morale, and was lacking in coordination with one another, north and south, etc. And then at the Tet New Year, when it was supposed to be a time of peaceful, ceasefire, the Vietnamese, they surprised us, and they had a very well coordinated attack. And when they attacked, they went into Saigon in South Vietnam, and there was a lot of coverage of Saigon and a place called Hue, Hue. And you could look up videos of this and you see soldiers fighting that way. And while they're fighting, the gentleman's asking them, what do you think of this war? You know, and they're saying, this is a darn mess. This is a fiasco. We shouldn't be here, et cetera, et cetera. And the amount of coordination and success initially that the Northern Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong in the South, enjoyed initially in the Tet Offensive was very sobering, to the point of making Westmoreland look like a naive buffoon, an arrogant man whose hubris had blinded him, or an outright liar. And so then, of course, you have to take into effect the anti-war protest movement here and the power of that protest movement. Because, of course, Ronald Reagan later on and others, right, contend that we didn't lose Vietnam. We had to give it up because of the hippies and the counterculture putting too much pressure here in the States. But it was the idea that we didn't have the stomach and the staying power to sustain those types of losses that the Vietnamese were willing to incur themselves for their own national liberation, for their own country and their own government. I personally, my father has always told me that his elder sister literally lost more than half of the young men in her graduating high school class in Vietnam. We lost 58,000, but I don't think that counts all the MIA and so forth. And so just a nasty war. And so Nixon, the gentleman who was so, identified as a crusader against communism, a no nonsense fighter, he's going to change, even though he's going to show a very disdainful attitude toward the left, toward the hippies and the counterculture and the protesters and so forth. He's going to, in some ways, acquiesce, and he's going to engage in Vietnamization and slowly pull out American troops and make the Southern Vietnamese themselves fight the war instead of us. And that obviously didn't work. And so at any rate, when you look at the third one, if you choose that one, it's very Vietnam focused. And it shows how this was just one of many national wars of liberation in the eyes of the Vietnamese people, of one foreign oppressor or aggressor or interloper after another. And it'll mention China, Japan, France, as well as the United States. All right. Also, what I want to share is just a moment on, let's see here. Option D here. Look at number 10. Castro failed the duck test for communism even before allying with the Soviet Union. Yes. Like I said, with his land redistribution programs, that seems to be true. American attempts to invade Cuba and kill Castro engendered his opposition, suspicion, and domestic popularity. Yes, people contend that. C, Kennedy became more militantly aligned with his chief military advisors after the Cuban Missile Crisis. No, he became more skeptical of them. He and his brother tended to steer away from their advice, the hardliners. And again, some people go so far as connecting it to conspiracy theories on the November 22nd assassination of Kennedy in '63. But look at D there, Ernesto or Che Guevara. His National Socialist Liberation Campaign elicited the CIA's wrath, which arguably led to Guevara's popularity and martyrdom globally. I think I subjectively meant that to be true. If you look at Ernesto or Che Guevara, if you just Googled Che, you see his famous picture with his beret on, right? That says Viva Che. It's absolutely iconic. He was an ideologue, much more so, arguably, than a lot of the communist leaders of governments like Fidel Castro. He wanted to follow the letter of the law, the letters of Karl Marx, right, and live out the teachings and the doctrine of Marxism as discerned from Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto and the writings of Marx and Engels. He was, just short of earning his MD from Argentina, well-connected, educated, wealthy background. He gave all that up and lived kind of a vagabond type life. He went to the Congo. He went to South America. He traveled all over trying to foment socialist revolutions against right-wing dictators, and also in countries, especially, he said, where the American octopus, as they called it, where American corporations had their hold. And so the CIA is going to have him handed over to him by the Bolivian government. Supposedly, literally, a goat farmer heard some noise and discovered that Che and his men were training on his property, just outside his property. And he notified the authorities, and Bolivia had a right-wing military government, and they got him in a shootout, and they captured him, and the CIA gave their blessing to kill him, and they assassinated, they executed him. But he was calling for national wars of liberation against capitalist countries, especially countries that were under the hold of American corporations. And so when we killed him, we kind of made a martyr out of him when he was killed in Bolivia. All right, so take a look at 11. According to the video, the American War of Vietnam was popularly embraced in South as well as in North Vietnam, where a small, aggressive, unpopular minority, let's see here, communists in the Viet Minh and National Liberation Front tried to impose their will on an unwilling majority. No, that's what we'd like to believe, but according to the video, that was not the case. Watch the video, look at evidence of the unpopularity of No Dinh Diem, our guy down in South Vietnam, was justified by the Geneva Convention, and that Ho Chi Minh refused to decide upon communism via a popular election. No, it was No Dinh Diem who refused to abide by that election. Ho Chi Minh had reason to believe that he would win it by popular vote. C was fought with American cognizance of Ho Chi Minh and communism's popularity, at least partially out of political determination to keep communism contained. Because remember the domino theory. Remember we had a guy named George Kennan who gave his famous telegram saying that Stalin was preparing for World War III against us, and we must stop the spread of communism anywhere and everywhere on the globe, right? Not allow them to accumulate any more allies anywhere on the global chessboard, if you will. And so it kind of came down to that in Vietnam, is the whole domino theory and the containment policy. But like I said, when you look at some of our ambassadors to Southern Vietnam, when you look at the CIA and some of their reports, there's evidence that we were aware, or the key people in power had reason to believe that we were not necessarily popularly embraced in Vietnam. All right. Any comments or questions? Any comments or questions?
So this is the this is for the Vietnam one. This is the Cold War test questions.
Yes, sir. Yeah, because the Vietnam, right, was an example of of our, what's the term they use, where we didn't flat out fight the Soviet Union, but we fought against the forces of communism in a surrogate war in Vietnam, and they connected in the history books to the Cold War.
Yeah. On my test questions, we only have 1 through 8.
Let me see here. See what I have on the first 3. So see, I put them together, right? Did I do that for you guys? I put the 2 together, the early Cold War assignment before the Civil Rights Movement assignment, and then this week's assignment. So the first questions you guys had, I posted for you a couple weeks ago.
Okay, let me check through Canvas.
Sure. And Jaden, I'd be happy to hear anything from your father if he has anything to add to Vietnam.
Okay.
Hey, I can tell you that I had to register for the draft.
Oh, wow.
The year before my numbers were going to be potentially called or let go, they initiated to volunteer, and I wasn't going to be potentially required. So,
wow,
kind of pins and needles moment, you know?
Oh, I bet.
What they did was they registered you for the selective service then, and you had to turn in a registration, but you then became only on a voluntary basis, and it was already concluding, you know.
I see. Wow.
So,
No, that's do you still have the paperwork from that? Have you kept that as a memento?
I did, and when my mom just passed, and I was going through her stuff, and I found my brother's as well.
Oh,
And
wow.
I may have discarded that because he's 6-7 years deceased now.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Oh,
Well,
but that's history. That's fascinating. I could only imagine the anxiety that I would have felt in that situation.
Well, I think that there's a lot of that going on right now with this whole mask mandate and things. I mean, there's people that are against war, and there's people against somebody telling them what they have to introduce to their body, right or wrong. I'm glad we have options, but I like the idea of being truly free, where you can make your own choice with the information you see important, right?
Uh-huh. No, absolutely.
I think every generation has some different dilemma that they have to that has to be debated.
Yes, and navigated. Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So on these questions 9, 10, and 11,
sure.
I like to try to have Jaden as prepared as possible. Where we heard you going over it, but we weren't catching on that it was new questions. So there's only 3 new questions being added for this final exam.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Where's our best source of being able to find this, since there's no written thesis?
Yeah, really, I mean, that's the thing is that's why I felt as if I should go over them with you, because I shouldn't expect you to watch all 3 of those videos. But they're right out of the videos.
Okay.
All 3 of them. So for instance, Truman stated, right, that he refused to endorse America's evolution toward a right-wing totalitarian type of government and atmosphere just to combat left-wing totalitarian communism. So in the video, he says just the opposite, and it shows his stance against the Red Scare. And so you would get that if you were to choose that video and watch that video. The same thing with number 10. The only exception was Che Guevara. I put that in there because I felt like that was a vital part of the narrative that the video didn't necessarily include. So that's why I wanted to make sure that I went over it with you guys today. But as for
So
the other options, A through C, you could get it, you could derive it straight from the video.
okay, so we should watch all 3 videos to answer these questions then.
Yes, if possible, that would be wonderful.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But otherwise, that's why I'm here right now, because I don't want to formally mandate that, because I know that's a lot to ask. So each of them is over an hour, and so yeah. So as for right now, it's same thing on number 11. Should you watch the war, the documentary that I chose for Vietnam? It's pretty clear. That C is the intended answer. Like I said, very much from a Vietnamese perspective on the origins of this war.
So where does okay, so it starts with the New Deal test questions. Is that where the first study guide started? Derek?
Yes, that's right. It begins with a New Deal. So what I'll be happy to do, if I haven't done that yet, is I'll post under this week, okay, under these questions that I have that are underneath the Cold War Part 2 assignment for this week. I'll post the entire test and let you guys take a look at it. Okay.
I think Jaden's ready to take the test. Hey, I got a question on number 10.
Yeah.
Number 10 is pretty much, I mean, I lived through that, right? I was very young when Kennedy was killed. And I've been fascinated by that. So I've gone to the Kennedy Memorial 3 times.
All right.
And I have a dear friend of mine that is crazed by Kennedy, and he's got a museum in his home in Modesto with probably 600, 700, 800 artifacts about Kennedy. And I took him one time, and he actually is trying to get a permit to go through the sewer to one of those suspected places where a gunman could have hid under the road.
Wow.
And so I can see that, Kennedy and his administration and the military were kind of torn apart during that time. So I could see which one on number 10 is obviously incorrect.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm certainly no expert on Kennedy, although I find the topic of Kennedy fascinating. But from what I have read and what I've watched on documentaries, that absolutely is the case, right? Is that he faced a sense of alienation, even almost hostility developed between him and the leading Joint Chiefs of Staff and XCOM, to the point of them tying it to conspiracy theories of them having cooperating and having him killed. Okay. Yeah, fascinating stuff.
So I think number 1, we'll watch that video and kind of figure it out. And if Jaden has time, he'll do them all. When will the test actually be posted? Because I think, he sets the whole night of Monday aside for studying this. And I think he'll be ready to take the test tonight.
Yeah, I don't know if I could have it on here by tonight. But I could certainly have it done well before the weekend if he wants to get it done early. Yeah. Okay.
Great.
I'll be happy to do that, to work on that.
Hey, and when Kennedy was assassinated, I was in a 56 Bel Air on McHenry Avenue, and it came across the radio. And my mom started crying. She was driving, of course, and I was in the passenger seat. Wow. And we went straight home, and she closed all of our blinds and locked all the doors, and we turned on the TV. and I was only 3, but I remember just being riveted to the TV. My mom was afraid that the Russians were going to be invading the US
Wow.
and that we weren't going to be able to be safe going to the store, going outside, and that our entire country was going to turn communist. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I could tell from my mom's, I remember my childhood very early. But from my mom's reaction to this was psychologically, these news broadcasts with Walter Cronkite were embedded in my brain. And I can remember it like it happened yesterday, you know?
That is fascinating. That really is. I could just imagine. Wow.
So kind of neat. We've been able to take Jaden back to his burial site and at Arlington, and been able to view a lot of that stuff. So
Oh, that's great. I envy that.
well, I know that Jaden has been thrilled in your class again for a second time at the 101, 102. And if you would consider teaching an additional history class that he hasn't taken yet, I'm sure he would be your first student signed up.
Well, I honestly, I'm superbly honored. I'm very, very honored by that, and I love having Jaden. Yeah, unfortunately, the teaching another class is out of my hands. As a
Yeah.
part-timer, we teach whatever we're told to teach.
No,
And I don't
get
mean that as a complaint. I just mean it is what it is.
Well,
And
I hope that the students that have your class appreciate the style in which you teach this, because history's come alive for Jaden, and I've
Good.
thoroughly enjoyed being involved in the process with him on this, because this is one of the father-son things we like to do together is learn things together, and you've made it a very interesting class, and these, having been graduated from college many years ago, the kids that take your class are blessed to have a teacher so passionate about his subject.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for that. Every instructor, anybody for that matter, in any field, we need psychological and emotional fuel. Sometimes we grow weary, and that gives me much fuel, encourages me to keep the fire going. So thank you. And I will truly miss you guys. And Kevin, you as well. Just having you, and I really will. There'll be a vacuum. I'll miss you guys in the future.
Well, our paths will cross again, I'm sure.
Good. I hope so.
You can't have such a common interest in something without our paths crossing. So
That's right. That's right.
all
Well,
right.
thank you.
Well, thanks for letting me speak with you for a minute.
No, thank you. I was hoping you would. All right. And so I will get on that. I will get on that final though. Okay, Jaden. And
Okay.
and Kevin, also I'll have it posted. Not only will I post it under quizzes for you to actually be able to take, but prior to that, I'm going to post it just as a file that you could look over and prepare there in modules on Canvas. Okay.
Okay. I did message you on Canvas about the late assignment that I had submitted for I think it was World War II.
Okay. Well, I will catch up, and I will catch up with my my messages, and I'll respond to you. Okay, Kevin?
All right. I just wanted to give you a heads up on that.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing so.
I sank in everything Jaden's dad said, though, man. Been an amazing teacher. Always have been since History
Oh,
101.
thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. All right. You guys have a great rest of your week. I'm only going to keep it that short because, I mean, we do have one more where I'm happy to answer any questions on the test itself in our final week next week. But also I'm just counting on the fact and hope that our paths will cross, and this won't be the end of seeing one another. But thank you guys, and you guys have a great rest of your week. Okay,
Maybe we'll be coworkers one day.
good. I look forward to it, Kevin. I really do.
Hey, Kevin, from your questions and the things that I've heard you commenting on, you're a very intelligent man, and
He is.
I've seen you add value to the class, and I believe that, you know, if this is your passion, you could do anything, and you'd be an excellent teacher.
He would.
Oh, thank you, man. I really appreciate that.
All right,
And I think he knows he has my endorsement. That's for sure.
that's awesome.
All
You guys
right.
have a good one.
You too. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.